The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe, and I'm very happy to have as my guest today Dutch MEP Michiel Hoogeveen. Michiel, very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here.
Sure. So a small introduction. Michiel is an MEP, I think, for 2 years now. Before that, he was working as an assistant to an MEP from the same party, of course. And before that, he has a history in the financial sector in the Netherlands. Worked with a Big Four company with a stock storage bank, if I can translate that.
Well, a custodian.
A custodian, of course.
Custodian
yeah.
bank.
Well, that actually makes more sense. So very welcome, Michiel. Today we will discuss, first of all, the conference on the future of Europe. So our listeners are quite familiar with this exercise. Which was started in 2021. I mean, already before the COVID crisis, there were plans for it. It was delayed. You have a very complex structure there, where an executive board controlling much of the action, much of the fun, and experts giving their opinions, and working groups that are supposed to prepare plenaries, coming up with all kinds of conclusions that are, I would say, conspicuously similar to what people supporting a more federal Europe want, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Conference on the Future of Europe was initially thought of by Emmanuel Macron when he was having problems in his own country with the yellow vests some time ago. And he thought of a way to listen to the people. He wanted to have the opinions of the yellow vests heard in his policy making. So what he thought of was this is what new political parties see as an alternative to the and I put it between brackets, populist referendum. They want to initiate citizen panels. So in order to have citizens involved in policy making, in politics, they invite them randomly selected citizens. They have these panels, and then the conclusions of these panels are seen as recommendations to the policy making. So Macron started doing this. He called it le grand débat, and he initially thought when the European elections from 2019 were finished and they had to form a new European Commission. He said, well, it's a splendid idea to also do this on the European stage. And this idea was then involved in the wheeling and dealing and the negotiating on the new Commission. From what I have heard, it was the deal that the Germans would get Ursula von der Leyen as Commission chair or Commission president, and then Macron would have his conference on the future of Europe. And that's exactly what we have seen the last couple of years. That's basically the background story.
And what's your opinion on sort of the process? Because I've, of course, followed the ECR campaign here, which was, I would say, rather critical. I mean, would you, assuming you would do an exercise like that, do you think it happened in a proper manner?
Well, first of all, we believe that, or at least my party believes that we believe in direct democracy. We believe that we should engage the citizens more in politics, in policy making, especially when people only go to the once in 4 years they have an election and then they decide on who is to govern their country. But when fundamental questions are being asked, you should also come back to the citizens or to the people. You can do that either via a referendum, but we also believe that a citizen panel can be an effective tool to make recommendations on policy making. At the same time, we saw that this initiative from Emmanuel Macron was already set up to be a one-way street in terms of in terms of European policymaking, and that one-way street is a one-way street to more towards more European integration. Some even say towards a federal European Union, and that is the problem that we had from the very beginning. We already saw that the structure of the conference itself was already fundamentally flawed because it was clearly steering towards a certain outcome. So in that respect, we try to engage. We try to be active in the conference, but it's unfortunate to see that now we are coming towards the end of the conference. That actually. Well, our initial fears of being a clearly biased conference, well, it has been confirmed.
Yes, and maybe one more thing. I wrote a briefing on this at some point, some time ago, and then yeah, it was undeniable how unbalanced the experts was. I mean, if I were to, let's say, organize this conference, I would at least I would have made sure to at least have a few token Eurosceptics.
Yeah.
But just to give it some kind of an air of neutrality. But I mean, not even that. They really couldn't help themselves, and they stuffed all the expert panels full of people that they agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, or perhaps it has improved. What's your idea on this?
Well, I think that they made up this Byzantine meeting circus, truly which truly represents the Brussels bubble, and they set this up, and it's an unbelievably complicated structure of meetings and people and citizens and representatives. And just to explain it very briefly, what the structure of this conference was when the citizens were involved. So first we had the national citizens panels. These were citizens selected by the national governments, and these were citizens who mostly are people from civil society organization or civil society NGOs, and we have seen that these NGOs have outspoken pro-EU integration views. So, for example, one of the NGOs involved in the conference was Pulse of Europe, which is a federalist organization that waves EU flags on Sunday.
Probably EU funded.
Exactly. So we have seen. So this is just one example, but we've seen many organizations. Business Europe, for example, was there as well. So these are already organizations that have an underlying organizational structure, but also knowledge about the EU and EU integration, and these organizations actually benefit from more EU integration. But also, for example, in the Netherlands, the citizens from the national citizens panels were students who had to apply, and they had to do a concours. So it was actually a quite high selection procedure. So that's the national citizen panels. Then we have the European citizen panels, and this is basically what they said. That was the most important panel, because these were randomly selected citizens. So they basically called 800 random European citizens. It was done by an independent organization called Kantar. They called these citizens, and they were asked to join this conference. So in principle, this is a randomly selected citizen. These are randomly selected citizens. However, what we have seen in the numbers is that more than half of the people that were called, at least in the Netherlands, were not willing to participate. So they kept calling until they had people who were willing to participate. And obviously, these were mostly people who also already have an interest in the EU, in EU integration, in EU policymaking. So when speaking to one of these citizens, he was a student, and he said, "Well, this is great on my resume. This is I feel like a politician." And so that's so those are the European citizens panels. So the fact of the matter is, are these really randomly selected citizens? Yes, but are they truly a representation of the peoples of Europe? No. Then the final platform was to engage and involve the citizens was the multilingual digital platform, and all citizens were able to express their ideas on the website, and they promised they would take these ideas into account. But if you take a look at, for example, migration, the most liked idea on the multilingual digital platform was, please stop migration from third world countries. Well, this has definitely not been implemented in the final report. So,
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
and these and then again, the multilingual digital platform, the people were invited to express their ideas, but when when we look at how many people have actually heard of the conference and know what the conference is, it's not even above 3%. So yeah, the question is this, was this truly a representative exercise? And well, now we are coming towards the end, and we can clearly say no.
And especially, I thought your example of this most liked ID. I mean, that's quite telling, right? Because
Yeah.
that's clearly not what they were wanting to hear. Perhaps what they were expecting to hear, of course. If you have a little bit of a sense for news, that does not surprise anyone, I think.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's quite telling.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's maybe move to what I would say is more important, much more important subject is the European Central Bank, how it's stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I probably don't have to recall for our listeners that we have a little inflation problem.
Yeah.
I mean, monstrous levels of inflation. I think the producer price in Germany last month was like the highest
Yeah.
increase in 70 years. I mean, we're breaking all records. Of course, there's a big component of energy, and of
Hmm.
course, it's not all because of the money printing of the ECB. I always say that if you do experiments with your energy policy, at some point things are going to go wrong.
Yeah.
And if you then have this massive war that we're having now, uh, the effect will be even bigger. But like I think it's fair to say there's no hiding for the European Central Bank, right?
Yeah, well, the European Central Bank and many of the people here in the European Parliament have been moving the goalposts
Mm,
on the inflation. First, they said, "Well, there is no inflation. You shouldn't worry." Then they started saying, "Well, there is inflation, but it's transitory. It's transitory inflation." Then
mm,
they said, "Well, it's because of the COVID crisis and the supply chain disruptions." And then they said, well, now they say, well, it's because of Putin. It's Putin's price hike. That's what they say. But and while they do have a point, as you mentioned, I mean, the
mm.
war in Ukraine is fanning the flames of inflation, and obviously we have seen supply chain disruptions due to lockdowns during the COVID pandemic, and less production, as a matter of fact.
And more
Um,
may be coming because of China's zero COVID
exactly.
totalitarian approach. Yeah,
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 and this is one of the biggest producers
yeah.
of consumer goods in the world. So indeed, they have a point,
Mm.
but they forget to mention that the seeds were planted long ago for this inflation to spiral out of control now, and that has been this low interest rate and asset purchasing policy that the European Central Bank has been doing ever since, well, what was it, 2012, when they started buying up these government bonds, when they started. Uh, when they started to see that the amount of debt of certain EU member states was unsustainable, they started buying up these government bonds. They started lowering interest rates in order to keep the economy going, because if you lower interest rates, then your economy will perform or will grow better. But in the end, they are now starting to see and feel the consequences. And um, there is no hiding. You cannot just say it's Putin's fault, or you cannot
Mm.
just say it's COVID's fault. The core principle and mission of the European Central Bank is to make sure there's price stability. And well, the numbers just point out that they're not doing exactly a very good job. So, but they planted the seeds. And in terms of inflation, it's harvest time. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, and what do you think? Like, should they do? I mean, do you think they should focus on increasing the interest rates, or generally shrinking the money supply, which would mean ending all these purchasing programs that are, of course, that originate in an expansion of the money supply that is then used to buy all these assets, and that are distorting bond markets,
Yeah,
not only
yeah,
public bond markets, but also they're buying bonds of companies, which I think is it's
yeah,
crazy that this is even legal. I mean, if I have a company, they can buy my bonds, but of course they only buy bonds of Volkswagen, and then they try to balance that a bit by also buying bonds from Italian producers.
yeah.
I mean, what is like, if you say like they have to prioritize one action, where should they start?
Well, I think you are exactly right in the beginning when you said they are between a rock and a hard place. Because if you either stop buying these bonds, it will have consequences. If you start hiking interest rates, it will have negative consequences. So it's difficult to say where, because it has been spiraling out of control. Um, that each move you make will have consequences, negative consequences. So it's difficult to say what they should do first. Um, what we believe is that we should start thinking outside of the box. And what we are now, when we look at the ECB and its central bank policies, and the tools they have, or the lack of tools they still have to tackle inflation, um, is is no longer working. So what you have to do is you have to zoom out, go outside the box, and see, okay, what system are we having right now in the Eurozone? We see now that because of the euro, because of the European Monetary Union, we're seeing vastly different economies together in one monetary union. And we believe it's time to really start discussing the future. And probably that's the most difficult but a very important first step, is to discuss
Mm.
the fundamentals of the eurozone. Where are we going with this, with the euro? And something we would very much like to discuss is, for example, if you hike interest rates, we know from the past that Italy and other countries in Southern Europe would get in trouble in order to
Mm.
finance their debt. Then President Emmanuel Macron and even now the Dutch finance minister Sigrid Kaag, they say, well, we should be more lenient on these countries and they should be allowed to have a larger debt for a longer period of time. And Macron even says, well, we should issue common European debt. So that's one solution if you go outside the box. We say, well, maybe it's time for us to acknowledge that we tried this nice experiment, the euro, but it has failed, and we should
Yeah.
look for solutions. And well, the thing I think is a very interesting discussion is the euro holiday, to have countries being allowed to leave the eurozone for a period of time to
Hmm.
devaluate their currency, to have a monetary policy that actually fits their economy. And maybe if they adhere to abide to the rules later, they can come back into the eurozone. But I think we think we should start having that discussion, because if you start having discussions on whether they should hike interest rates or stop buying government bonds, etc., I mean, very important discussion, but you will not tackle the underlying problem of the eurozone, and that's basically the one size fits no one structure.
Exactly, but of course, if you do that, then we would see a series of defaults. I mean, in effect, there was this panel discussion between Lagarde, and then the head of the Fed and the head of the IMF. I don't know if you saw it, and the Bulgarian IMF chief, uh, Gorgieva, if I pronounce that well.
Hmm.
She actually said, "Look, it's possible that we see a series of sovereign defaults." I think she was more pointing at non-Western countries that may see food price challenges and everything.
Yeah,
But I mean, if you look at it, like, if the ECB actually is serious about stopping inflation, then yeah, we have a whole number of candidates in the eurozone that won't be able to service their debt. Perhaps not right away, but
Mhm.
that point would come soon enough. So you would probably combine the euro holiday or even the euro, let's say, decomposition
Mhm.
with a large scale debt restructuring conference, right?
Well, that's probably an inevitable consequence, as we've seen now that the amount of debt of these countries has continued to grow ever since the euro crisis. The debt wasn't lowered. I mean, it has increased,
Mm-hmm.
and the I think that every policymaker and each researcher has acknowledged that the amount of debt we're having right now and we're moving towards is unsustainable within the confinements of the current structures that we're having. And even I heard that some economists, I think it was Lex Hoogduin who said it recently, is that it's also inevitable for some countries indeed to have a restructuring of debt, and
Mm.
also to have debt, um, well, to have it well restructured in that sense. But yeah, uh, you have to start having the discussion, and if you don't have the discussion, or if you're not if you don't dare to speak about these topics, then how can you work towards a solution? And that's also the problem I'm facing here in the European Parliament,
Yes.
is that if you want to have the discussion, it's already a taboo. It's already
Mm.
a taboo to discuss a restructuring of the eurozone, a possibility for countries to leave the eurozone. I mean, it's unthinkable to have this discussion, and if you even start the discussion, you are already behind the cordon sanitaire. So I think that's also a big problem.
And yeah, maybe I want to go a bit more into that. What is your strategy when you're able to ask questions to ECB officials coming to speak in the EP? I mean, yeah, do you feel there's some things you can move there, or is it hard?
Um, the most frustrating thing here is the fact that in the European Parliament there's no real debate. There
Okay.
you can ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
or actually one question, and then, for example, Christine Lagarde is allowed to answer, but I'm not allowed to ask another question.
Jeez.
That's probably also due to time constraints, but
Mm-hmm.
because we are here with 705 members of European Parliament. Um, but it's increasingly frustrating, also because the topics of discussion are already predetermined. And what I have experienced for the last year is when having these monetary dialogues with Christine Lagarde, most of the time the answers are read from either a teleprompter or a note,
Mm.
and you would like to ask beyond you would like to start a debate or initiate a discussion. So
Yes.
what we try to do is that when we look at her interviews, we look at her policy documents, and then we try to on the basis of these of her earlier announcements or earlier ECB publications, we try to ask a very specific question, and she has to give a specific answer.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, you probably know as well that how politics work. If you ask
Yeah.
for yes or no, you get neither.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. I remember that the ECB has suffered a lot of pressure because of the fact that like housing price inflation is not included, and now it will be supposedly, but
yeah,
I understand only in a partial manner, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we asked Christine Lagarde to do this, and she also said she wanted to include it into the inflation index, the European
Mm.
inflation index. But the housing price, obviously, it's quite difficult to have this included in the inflation index. Also because, well, if you buy a house, it increases in value. But how do you actually put this in inflation? I mean, if you have housing prices, yeah, it's a difficult factor to put it in. Um, coming back to this inflation index, what I find quite interesting is that, and coming back to the very first question you asked, is this inflation index where the ECB's economists say, well, we we shouldn't worry that much about inflation, because if you look at the index, it's mostly food and energy prices. And
Mm.
then if you put the food and energy prices out, then there's just a core inflation, which that is not very high. But then we say, well, probably energy and food prices will not go down on the short term. So we say, well, you should be worried about this high inflation
Well,
rate.
that's what a former chief economist of the ECB said, that core inflation is only relevant for people that do not transport themselves, or
Exactly.
and that don't eat.
Yeah.
But yeah, like of course, this whole discussion about the housing dates back from the age where we had inflation, or massive increases in prices,
Yeah.
but mainly in the housing and the hard asset sector, stocks. And
Yeah.
they said, "Oh, there's no inflation," but then you could see housing prices
Yeah.
going through the roof.
Yeah.
And now, of course, this has, combined with all the other factors, has. I mean, it's undeniable. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and especially for my country, the Netherlands, it's just these hike in housing prices. It's just it's just getting increasingly difficult. Not
mm,
only because housing bubbles are being formed, people are taking on mortgages. They just look at their monthly payments, and that's very low
mm,
because of the low interest rate. But they don't look at the value of the property that they're buying. And I still remember the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And I'm not saying this will happen one on one again, but you can see that housing prices can go down by 25% easily.
yes.
And then if you have to sell your house, then you have a big problem. And also in the Netherlands, uh, housing is already quite scarce. I mean, there's not a lot of space in the Netherlands to buy houses again, or to build houses. So it's also putting younger people who want to start a family that are not able to buy a house
Mm.
outside of society. So it's yeah, this housing problem is a big problem and a consequence of ECB policies.
Yeah, it's a very good point that indeed, of course, people that are very wealthy don't have to care that much. They actually profit from this.
Yeah.
But we should never forget the whole point of low interest rates and central banks serving to monetarily finance governments. And that's, so governments can spend. And in Europe, that's mostly on all kinds of social programs meant to help the weak.
Yeah.
So the weak are the victim, and they are the victim ultimately as the result of government spending programs
Yeah.
meant to help them. Well, and then of course we have this. The second reason is to keep the eurozone construct alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Good. Well, maybe let's move to the next subject I wanted to discuss with you, Michiel, which is migration. You mentioned that it's, according to the multilingual digital platform,
Yeah.
the number one concern of citizens, and I think friend and foe will admit it's very high up. And from my Brexit days, I would say that people are not so much angry about somebody moving from another country.
Hmm.
They're angry when they see that it happens in an uncontrolled manner,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what's your view on this, and what can the EU change about it?
Well, I always found the entire migration issue fascinating on EU policy level, because the EU is having trouble with legitimizing itself to the people. So they're having an image problem. People don't like the EU. It's too distant. What's really the added benefit for the people? And then I always said, well, we have this common market, this common European market, which is
Mm,
of tremendous added value for the citizens, for our people, for our
yes.
businesses. But if you have a common market, you should also protect the common market. And that's by protecting your borders. And that's what they refuse to do. And people really see, they see their neighborhoods changing. They see the images of people flowing into the European continent with either boats, or they try to attack the borders. The, 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 the very thing that the EU could do to make itself popular is to tackle this problem. And
Mm.
we have constantly been saying that as an EU, if you create or if you actually copy or try to copy the policies, successful policies by, for example, Australia, then the EU would be so much popular with the people. But
Yes.
they are so ideologically stern in they're so stern in their ideology that they don't want to change the policies because of either human rights or the fact
Yes.
that migration is something that they see as an added value. But we are talking about illegal, irregular migration, and that's what
Yes.
people want to tackle.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think people have a problem if you have a controlled way of inviting people. For example, we have a big problem with nurses. These are relatively high skilled
Yeah,
individuals. You can't just train them like that. So I think there's perfect sense to try to find somewhere in the world nurses and invite them to come and work in Europe.
no,
But like the every irregular migrant that has no skills that manage to enter into the EU. I mean, I feel for these people. I would probably do the same. I don't blame them. But
mm,
if you assume that there's a limited number of people we can welcome, that
no,
means that every person who breaks the rules is one person less with specific skills
no.
that we no longer can welcome in theory, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is that when talking about inviting people to come to, for example, the Netherlands or Belgium or France, because there's a shortage of certain skilled workers. I mean, there's no
Mm,
problem with that. You can always
mm,
look for talent around the world, invite them to come over. Also, for example, in IT, there's a massive shortage
mm,
in the IT sector. Well, I'm very much in favor of that. You give people a permit, but at one point they have to leave.
mm,
I visited Korea, South Korea, many times. They have a very very strict but fair migration policy, and that's just the principle. No illegal migration, but massive amounts of people are invited to come and work in South Korea. But at one point, you have to go back. You have to leave, and I'm very much in favor of that. But what we are seeing now is that uh, we have a passive we a very passive migration policy, but we should have a more active, proactive
mm.
migration policy. Um, and I think definitely that there is something to it's something to work with. And also, if we talk about the European common market, I mean, in the Netherlands, there's a massive shortage of people who are willing to work in slaughterhouses or centers of distributing goods. I mean, that
Yes.
we need people from either Eastern or middle or Eastern Europe as well, and we already have free movement of people. So there's also there are also lots of people who can work within the European Common Market in the Netherlands where there is a shortage. So there's not necessarily a need to bring people from the other side of the world to Europe. Um, so yeah, that I think that's really the main problem, and that's the problem that the EU has to tackle.
And maybe one more point on this. What's your opinion on then the UK scheme where they have agreed something with Rwanda?
Mhm.
So basically, if you try to sneak in illegally into the UK, there is a chance, it's apparently not certain, that you will be transported to Rwanda, where you will have to apply for asylum.
Yeah, well, we think that's an excellent system that they are putting in place the because we're now talking not only about labor migrants but also genuine refugees from
Mm,
fleeing from war,
mm,
and all the treaties we have signed say, well, you have to give these people a safe haven.
yes.
Um, uh, and that's exactly what the UK is now doing. But what we see with these genuine refugees are also uh, probably in the majority economic illegal migrants. So
Mm,
people coming either from Middle East or Africa to seek a better future, and that's just unsustainable. So we believe it's very good because as soon as they get in on the European continent, they move towards the illegality. They can move freely between EU member states. So they reach the continent, but they never leave. So what the UK is now saying, well, there's no one coming in. We give people a safe haven. They can ask for asylum in that safe haven, in this case, Rwanda, and then the genuine refugees are allowed to come to the UK. But the economic migrants, well, they are not allowed in, and they will be brought back to their country of origin. I think it's a very fair system and a sustainable system.
Yeah, and imagine if the whole of the EU would negotiate. You could, I mean, you could do it as a much larger scale. And frankly, I think if I were an economic migrant, and yeah, if I knew that I would, end up maybe in a place like Rwanda, that's actually, that is economically booming,
Hmm.
assuming that it would be. Indeed an economy where it's attractive to live, then yeah, I wouldn't mind. Of course, maybe I still would prefer to come to the West,
Hmm.
like assuming that the West can only welcome X number of people. You can discuss about that, of course. There's
Yep.
fair debate about to be had, but I think few people are willing to welcome anyone.
Yep.
So even if you're the most generous advocate of migration, you're going to have to say no to some people. And then the question is, okay, what do you do with these people? And then
Yep.
what's wrong to try to find some kind of a second best solution? In the past, I've written about refugee cities, with Hong Kong as the great example, British Hong Kong,
Hmm.
which actually served as a heaven for 30 million
Yep.
Chinese people that run away from Mao when Mao was still celebrated in the West.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the UK did a fantastic job for humanity there by simply welcoming them in a jurisdiction where it's safe. Not everything was perfect, but and if Britain could do that 70, 80 years ago, why would the combined industrial countries, not only Western countries, also Korea, Japan, not
Hmm.
be able to organize a number of these cities somewhere where it's safe, where it's of course negotiated, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think that could be true. However, what we are seeing already is when people are in their boat and they get to shore in, for example, Italy or Greece. I mean, for these people, that's not their final destination. They want
mm,
to. They always say, or always they mostly say, I want to go to Germany. I want to go to Netherlands because they know it's the best alternative they have. So as
mm,
soon as they reach the Greek Isles, they can move towards northwestern Europe. So when saying that when you have an economic migrant and the prospect is Rwanda, I don't think it's a really attractive prospect for these for people. But
mm,
so the consequences of having these policies in place is that the initial thought of actually taking the risk and trying to move towards the European continent is removed. And in that sense, people will stay in their country of origin, and then I'm talking about economic migrants, not genuine refugees. And you take away the business model of the people smugglers who are
mm.
putting these people in their boats. So it's a win-win.
Yes.
And in that sense, I believe that this is really a policy that we should pursue. And I think the UK has it has well, we're seeing a lots of people who are angry with the UK government for making this decision, but I think that's a very vocal minority. I think the silent majority truly supports these kinds of policies.
Yes, I think I agree with that. Okay, great. Maybe one more point when it comes to reform of the EU. Then, of course, I'm talking about reform along the lines of the perspective of Brussels report,
Yeah.
meaning more decentralization, more opening up of markets, opening up the services market, for example.
Hmm.
The, like more let's say a more scientific approach to regulation, a light touch regulation, more mutual recognition. I mean, is that is that even on the card? Is that a pipe dream, or do you think it's worth still advocating for it?
What do you mean exactly?
Well, like are we, especially with the von der Leyen Commission, should we give up hope for reform of the European Union?
Okay. Yeah, well, it's always difficult when having these discussions on whether it's possible to reform the EU towards a more decentralized institution where we maybe renationalize some of the components. I'm a Democrat and I still believe that through elections you can change the EU. I believe that if the people of France would wanted to have Le Pen as president, she would have become president and she would have been able to initiate reforms on an EU stage. So in that sense, yes, I still believe that we can reform the EU towards the way we see it, or the way as my party see it. But then we have to start being more strategic. So you have to appeal to a larger audience of the electorate, and that's especially the curse of well, I don't like to talk in left and right wing politics, but if we should do it like that, or if we do, then for lack of better word, right wing politics, it's that things are being said that are unrealistic, that are out of line, and scare away a large part of what I call the silent majority. So we need to be smart, we need to be strategic, and we need to be able to create an alternative, a realistic, viable alternative to the current EU, what we don't like, but we have to create a vision for people that they say, well, that's exactly what we want. And then you can win elections, and then you can start changing the EU. I don't agree with naysayers who say, well, it's no longer possible to reform the EU, and we should therefore leave the EU. Well, for the Netherlands,
Yes.
I mean, leaving the EU is, or at least leaving the single market or the common market, it's economic suicide. So leaving the EU should never be off the table, because if we are if we do get into this irreversible transfer union in the Eurozone, what we discussed earlier, then well, we should definitely start discussing these kinds of things. But in the meantime, we truly believe that you should present a viable alternative to the EU bureaucracy, and then you should start convincing the people, and then start working together with other parties and governments in the EU to fully realize this potential. And that's exactly the problem we're seeing on the right, is that there's no organization, there's no vision, there's no structure, and the left, well, they have it. They have it, and they are organized, and they have their vision, and they know where they want to go. So yeah, I think that's where we should be heading for.
All right, good. Well, that all makes sense, of course. So thank you very much, Michiel Hoogeveen, for this discussion, and I wish you the best of luck with your excellent work in the European Parliament.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Brussels Report podcast.